Well, welcome those who are on site and those who are online with us this morning. We're truly glad that you've chosen to join us for the purpose of worshiping, but also for learning and fellowshipping together today. And you've also joined us on the first week of a new sermon series we're starting today called Tough Questions. As we see there, we're examining 5 big questions that are used to confront Christianity. Now, what do we know about Christianity? We're probably familiar with the idea that Christianity is the most widespread. It is the largest faith, the largest religion in the world. But what do we also know? If you've been around the church, if you've been around the things of Christianity for a period of time, we also probably know that Christianity asks its followers to place their faith in some pretty big ideas. True? Think about some of the things we just sung about and talked about this morning already. The idea that not only is there a God, but that you can know God and that you can be known by God and called a child of God. We sang about that today. We also sang and talked about how God is good and God is loving all the time. And we talked about the theology. If you look at the theology behind the songs that we've talked and sung so far, we talk about not only God, but God as a Trinitarian God. And this belief that if you place your faith in Jesus Christ, you will live forever. Aren't those some pretty big statements? And I bet every single one of us, whether you're on site or if you're online, if that is part of something that you're familiar with, if part of something that you have associated yourself with, and somebody in the outside world finds out, you have probably found yourself in a situation or being confronted with a question about these things. And it's not unusual for this. I remember even myself, when I was in seminary, I was taking a course on apologetics. Now, that term apologetics means learning to defend a faith position. Apologetics is the ability and the study of defending a position of faith. And so I'm in this apologetics class in seminary, and it's the first class, the first day. And what do you do on your first day? If you've been to university, if you've been to college, you know, the very first class, the very first day, you get your syllabus. And then the professor walks through the syllabus, and they explain the books that they've written that they want you to buy and to read as part of the course. You get a sense of the schedule, where the breaks are, where the assignments are due, where the exams are going to be. And then you spend a little bit of time kind of walking through the syllabus to look at what are the main topics, what are the main subjects and themes we're going to cover throughout the course of the semester. And so in this apologetics course, we were doing that. We were walking through all the different topics and themes that we're going to be covering. And because it was apologetics, the topics and themes were basically the major objections to the Christian faith. And being the first day of class, the professor was not offering any answers to these objections. He was simply stating the question, stating the opposing position. And as I sat there, I found myself thinking, those are all really good points. Those are all really good questions. And as I listened to these different questions and themes, I felt like a boxer who was getting a left and a right and a blow after blow. It felt like the knockout was about to come because it was challenging what I held true for so many decades of my life. Until finally this one lady in the class yelled out, "Stop it! I came here to learn how to defend my faith, not lose it in the process." The professor didn't know the power he had in just offering these statements and questions, because there are some good questions. There are some tough questions that we have to be aware of and wrestle with. And that was just the syllabus of the class. You can imagine what is ahead in the days. Now, if that happens in a seminary, we know what happens in the world, don't we? We know what happens in university classes. We know what happens when you talk to coworkers in your offices. We know if you go on YouTube or on Instagram or on TikTok, you will be confronted with some tough questions. And there's a couple common ways that Christians respond to this. One of the ways is, we could call it avoidance. Don't ask and don't tell. I'm happy. I'm content in my world. I'm content in what I know and believe, and just don't challenge it. There's the avoidance tendency. Some others become selective on what they want to believe. Well, I know I believe Jesus was a good teacher. I believe there were good moral values in what he did and said, and I can follow those, but this idea of a Trinity, this idea of I can have a relationship with God, these miraculous walking on water kind of stuff, I'm going to leave that to the side, and I'll just take the philosophies and the good teachings. We become selective on what we believe because it's safer that way. And then there are those people who I know, and you might know some people too, who grew up in the church and then they were confronted with these questions and they just fell away from faith. They became overwhelmed by the questions. And they assumed there could not possibly be an answer to any of them. But what if there was an answer? What if there was an answer to these tough questions? And not only if there was an answer to these tough questions, what if? What if the answer to these tough questions was actually more convincing? What if the answer to these tough questions was actually more logical than the alternatives? And over the next few weeks, I want to tackle 5 tough questions that you're likely to encounter in the world around you, that will be used to try to confront a Christian's faith. And I want to begin to show you, there's so much more that could be said than I can fit into a time of a sermon. There's so much more that could be said. But I want to begin to show you that there are strong evidence-based responses to all of these questions. So that's where we're going the next couple of weeks. And I want to begin today by tackling a foundational question. Foundational question that simply states, how can you even believe God exists? How can you even believe God exists? Can you prove the existence of God? Has anyone ever asked you that before? How can you prove God even exists? Now, here's what I want you to understand about this question. This question in reality is a question about providing evidence for the existence of God. And now, you'll find different positions on this. You'll find that there's what we refer to as atheists, who will believe that there is no God. There is no supernatural realm. All that exists is the natural world. You'll also find people who refer to themselves as agnostics, which means they would say, well, even if God exists, we can't actually know anything about his nature. We can't actually experience God. If God exists, and there's a possibility he exists, but I won't be able to experience him. So you have atheists where there is no God. Agnostics where there is a God, but an unknowable God. And when you find people in these more secular positions, you'll often hear them say things like, well, all that we know for sure, all that we can know definitively that exists is what we can experience in the physical world around us. And when they come to that position, they'll quite often start to posit a dichotomy between faith and science. Where on the side of science and the natural explorations of the world, they'll say, over here we can test the natural world and we can get proof of things. But then over here you have the supernatural, where you can't really test or prove anything. And so over here you have proof, and over here you have blind faith, they would say. This is sort of the dichotomy position. You have proof of things over here and blind faith over here. Now, I want to suggest to you the first problem with this point of view is it's not actually intellectually or logically honest when that comes up. Because to suggest that anybody can live simply over here and with no faith is not intellectually honest or logically possible. So let's define faith first of all, because sometimes this position is used to talk about faith as a blind faith, but blind faith would be foolish. But that's not what the Bible talks about when it talks about faith. What is faith? Faith, I think the best way to understand it is faith is the gap that exists in the middle. Faith is the gap that exists between evidence and belief. And we all have to arrive at beliefs on things in this world. We all have to arrive at beliefs that we hold, but we can never have enough evidence to get us all the way there. There's always a gap between evidence and belief. And where that gap exists is where faith fits in. Hebrews 11:1 explains faith this way. It says, faith is confidence in what we hope for, what we believe. That's the belief. Faith is evidence in what we hope for, what we believe, but it's assurance about what we do not see, the gap. There's a gap that exists. There's evidence. There's the gap of the things that we do not see that leads us to what we hope for those beliefs. Now, here's the thing. This is not something that only religious people have. Even the most devout atheist lives with faith. And they may not like that idea, but you can simply give them this example. Whether they're a theist or an atheist, if you are sick and go to the doctor and get a prescription, and you take that prescription and you hand it to the pharmacist, and then the pharmacist hands you back a bottle of pills, you take those pills, don't we? We take the pills. But here's the thing. Do you actually know what you just ingested? You don't. Did you do a chemical analysis of the pills that were inside that bottle? No. The fact that you took those bottles from the pharmacist, opened them up, poured yourself a glass of water, and popped a couple of pills to try to get better is an act of faith. It's an act of faith based upon evidence to arrive at a belief. But think about what just happened there. There's evidence that the doctor and the pharmacist did well in school because they got degrees on the wall. There's evidence that they tend to have a faithful practice because they're still in business. There's faith placed in the manufacturing systems of medications in Canada. There's faith that historically when you give a prescription, you get what you ask for. There's evidence of those things, but we don't know for sure. But based upon the evidence that we have, it allowed us to arrive at a belief. But did we know with 100% certainty? We never actually tested the chemical analysis. We don't really look up on the internet and go, what should this pill look like? The shape and the size and the markings on it. No. As an act of faith, based upon the evidence available, we arrived at a belief. Does that make sense? Everyone lives with some degree of faith. Some degree of faith is required in order to live. Because here's the thing, if you questioned and had to test right down to the minute detail every single thing that exists in this world, you would go crazy. You would be curled up in a ball on the floor. We just cannot live without some degree of faith in all of our lives, regardless of your religious affiliation. There's very little in this world that we can even come close to definitively proving. The rest of it, we take the available evidence, we arrive at a belief, but there'll always be some degree of gap between those. That's the first issue I have with somebody saying this dichotomy of, well, there's this or there's this. No, all of us live in here somewhere. All of us live with some degree of faith. My second issue when people posit this dichotomy between science and faith is actually a false dichotomy. Because they're saying you can either have this or you can have this. But I would suggest to you that you can have both. It's not an either or. It can be a both and. And how can I say that? Well, because I believe that the fields of history and science and philosophy do not necessarily lead us away from God. I believe that if we truly study them with open hearts and minds, they actually can lead us towards God. And it's not just me that believes that. You see, if you look into the origins of the higher education, of the institutions that exist in our world, the universities and the scientific method that exists within our world, you know where it began? It began in the church. It began in the church. It began with this belief that if God created all things that exist, as we study it, we're learning more about Him. If you go back in time to some of the largest, most well-known original universities, such as Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Oxford, they were founded by the church. Even if you go to the University of Alberta, they have a motto. It's in Latin. I'm not going to try my Latin on you today. But if you take the University of Alberta's motto in Latin and translate it to English, you know what it is? Whatsoever things are true is the U of A's motto based upon Philippians chapter 4. If you go to the University of Calgary, their motto is, I will lift up mine eyes, based upon Psalm 121. Even our own universities in our own province have their roots in the origins of faith in the church. The university and the seminary I went to at Taylor, their motto is, all truth is God's truth. Basically stating that when we discover something about creation in the world around us, when we discover something about ourselves, we are discovering something about God. There is a bounty of evidence available for us for the existence of God. There's a bounty of evidence for us for the existence of God in the world around us. And in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, it says this, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and His divine nature have clearly been seen. They've been understood from what has been made. And because we can look and we can see God's fingerprints in the world around us, it says we are without excuse. So I want to suggest to you today, before we jump into some evidence, I want to suggest to you today that the issue is not with the existence of evidence. I also want to suggest to you the problem today is not even with the presence of faith. That more often than not, the problem we bump into is a person being willing to follow where the evidence leads. Verse 21, Paul continues, for although they knew God, even though they could look at the world around them and see the evidence and they knew God, They neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him. Even though they could see him, they neither glorified him nor gave thanks to him. The evidence is there. But people would rather believe in something else more often than not. But here's a quote that I think is really important that kind of pulls this together. There's a famous philosopher once said this. He said, God has put enough into this world to make faith in him a most reasonable thing. But he has left out just enough to make it impossible to live by sheer reason alone. God has put enough into this world to make faith in him a very reasonable thing, but he has left out just enough to make it impossible to live by sheer reason alone. So let's take a look at some evidence from the world around us that gives us reason to conclude that yes, God truly does exist. And to do so, we're going to go back to the start. We're going to go back to the beginning. We're going to go to the origins of the universe itself. Now, you might be familiar that there are sort of two prominent secular views on how this all got started. And one of those prominent views, but it's the lesser of the two, is what's referred to as the steady state theory of the universe. And really very simply, the steady state theory of the universe says the universe always existed. It's been always constant in density. It's always been constant in energy. And then as a star or a galaxy exists and it comes into existence on one side, at the same rate, there's another star or galaxy that disappears in order to maintain this steady state of existence and allows it to exist eternally. Now, the reason that was put forth, this steady state theory, the reason it was put forth was actually to address problems with the second, more common theory, which you're probably familiar with, referred to as the Big Bang. And this theory basically is an example of where Edwin Hubble looked through his telescope and he discovered that the universe is actually expanding. And not only is it expanding, it's decreasing in energy. That means it's not steady. It's getting larger and decreasing in energy. And the conclusion that scientists arrived at from this is that the universe, therefore, must have began with a massive explosion. If it's getting bigger and decreasing in energy, there was a time when it had more energy and was smaller. And so they concluded that it must have had this massive explosion at one point where this infinitely dense single atom exploded and it hurled the stars and the planets outward. Now, remember when I said that view was a problem, which is why others brought up the steady state universe theory? You know why it was a problem? Because if that's what we're observing in the world around, if that's what we observe in the universe, and it leads us to that conclusion, that means that all space and all matter and all energy and all time had a beginning. They had a beginning. And as physicist J.M. Wersinger famously said in those circles, not only did the Big Bang model seem to give into the Judeo-Christian idea of the beginnings of the world, but it also called for a supernatural creation. That's why it was a problem. Because it said things began, and it calls for a supernatural act of creation. Why does it call for a supernatural act of creation? Because of, and you have to stick with me for a second on this one, because of this fundamental philosophical concept that is accepted by all philosophers, it's accepted by all scientists, whether atheists or theists. There's this fundamental concept called contingency. What is contingency? Here's the technical definition. If something begins to exist, it exists dependent upon something outside of itself that pre-existed, that caused it to come into existence. Okay? Now, it might be a bit of a word jumble, but let me give you an example of what contingency means. Every single one of you here, your presence, your existence is contingent upon your parents. It's contingent upon the fact that your parents existed before you. It's contingent upon the idea that your parents met, they fell in love, and your dad lit some candles, and so on, right? It's contingent upon all of that taking place. You being here is contingent upon that happening before you came into existence. If that didn't take place, you wouldn't be here. True? Right. And so there's contingency principle. Everything that begins to exist has to have a pre-existing cause outside of itself. So where did this all begin, is the question. If something always comes from something, and we just simply continue to look at the material universe, well, this came from this, which came from this, which came from this, which came from this, we find ourselves in what's referred to as an infinite regress. We find ourselves going back in time, and this sort of infinite chicken and egg. Which came first, the chicken or the egg, the chicken or the egg, the chicken or the egg? We never get to anything beyond that. It's this infinite regress we get into, unless there's what philosophy refers to as the first cause. A first cause. In order for a first cause to be outside of that infinite regress, it has to pre-exist everything that comes from something. It has to be non-material, neither to create material. And it has to have no beginning itself. Hebrews 11:3 says this, by faith, based upon evidence, by faith we understand the universe, all that is, was formed at God's command, so that what is seen, what's physical in our world, was made out of what's outside of what's physical. What is made, what is seen, was not made out of what's visible, made outside of that. Basically, we can look at this and say when Hubble looked through his telescope, what he was seeing was Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God said, let there be light. And bang, there was light. We need a first cause. That's accepted by all fields of science and philosophy. But often science and philosophy will try to eliminate God as the first cause. And they'll come up with some humorous ideas, such as, well, you may have heard this one before. There are theories that perhaps alien races sort of seeded the earth and brought technology, bring things into creation. And even if that was true, it doesn't solve the infinite regress. Because then you could ask the question, well, where did they come from? But the most common theory is that nothing caused this to come into existence. But do the math on that. Do the math on that. Basically, the theory is nothing times nothing equals everything. Nothing times nothing equals everything. Now, I pose this question to you. Does that make less logic than a first cause? And does that require more faith than God as the first cause? So I suggest to you, if everybody agrees a first cause needs to exist, that actually God, a supernatural, pre-existing, all-powerful, eternal God, as silly as it may sound to some people, that actually is more logical and takes less faith than the other alternatives. Therefore, we can begin to see that by the sheer fact the universe exists, it gives us evidence that God exists as the first cause of it all. Amen? Amen. But that's just the start. That's just the start of it. Because we can look at what exists and we can actually dive deeper in and find even more evidence as we dive into the complexity and the fine-tuning of all that exists. And to help you understand what we mean by this, consider, for example, if you go out for a walk this afternoon after church and you're walking down the sidewalk and you see some leaves just sort of blowing across the sidewalk. You wouldn't think too much of it, right? Well, the leaves, they came off, they fell off the tree, and the wind is blowing them around. They're being scattered. It's no big deal. It's just sort of a natural process. But as you walk along, and some of those leaves blow away, and all of a sudden they reveal something. You bend down to pick it up, and you find that somebody had dropped a watch. Now, even if you didn't know what a watch was, when you look at it, and if it was one of those ones where you can see through, like into all the gears and the mechanics, whether you knew what a watch was or not, even just by looking at that watch, and you would see the gears moving in perfect synchronicity with each other. You would see the hands on the clock moving. You would hear the synchronized ticking taking place. And you would look at that, and you would think to yourself, that is so complex. There's such precision to what I'm holding in my hand. It must have been designed. True? Astrophysicists look at the universe and they have identified 122 variables that need perfect, precise alignment in order for the universe to work, in order for life to exist. Things like the rate of gravity and electromagnetic fields and nuclear forces and the speed of light, the mass of protons and electrons and things that people smarter than me understand way more than me. But they have identified 122 different things that need to precisely align. And they say that even if one of those was off by 1/1,000,000th of a millionth, everything that we know right now would basically implode upon itself. And therefore, the odds that everything that we have exists, the odds that everything we have exists is so tiny. It's at the level of what they refer to as miraculous. And I'm going to cover miracles in week 5. But to give you an idea of why this is referred to as miraculous, consider these analogies, for example. We're familiar with the lottery, and some of us are familiar with slot machines, right? Now, the odds that you would pull the handle on a slot machine and hit the jackpot is 1 in 10 to the power of 7. That means that it's a 1 with 7 zeros after it, okay? That's what 1 to 10 to the power of 7 means. And so the idea that you could grab a handle on the slot machine, pull that down, and hit the jackpot is in the range of 1 in 10 million chances, okay? So don't go to the casino. It's a fool's game, okay? Don't do that. But that's our starting point. Now consider, they've estimated the grains of sand that exist in the entire world. Sand. They've estimated the entire number of grains of sand in the entire world is 10 to the power of 18, okay? That is 1 with 18 zeros after it. I don't know what the name of that number is. Can we agree it's a big number? That's the number of grains that exist in the entire, grains of sand in the entire world. It's actually similar to the number of seconds that have passed from the time of the creation of the universe till today. Similar number of seconds have passed. That's the size of numbers we're talking about here. Now, the odds that we live in a fine-tuned universe is 10 to the power of 120. That is a 1. I didn't have room to write the number. 1 with 120 zeros after it. That is a number that is beyond description. That's a number that is beyond our ability to fathom. That is a number that simply pushes us into the realm of miraculous. True? And let me help you visualize this. Now, either we can't fathom, let me help you visualize what this number would mean, what it would look like. Imagine you did go into a casino, which I'm not saying this is your homework assignment, but let's say you did go, okay? And you saw 122 slot machines all lined up. Remember those 122 variables that exist in order for all of this to exist. You saw 122 slot machines all lined up, and you walked up and you popped in your quarter, and you pulled that lever, jackpot, 1 in 10 million chance. Time to go home, right? Nope. You have to go to the next one. Pop in your quarter, pull the handle, jackpot. And you need to continue doing that consecutively 122 times. And that is the scale and the size of what we're talking about when we talk about the likelihood, the odds that all of this exists, perfectly tuned and synchronized, existing, came into being. Isn't that amazing? And even if by chance all those slot machines did hit jackpot and all lined up, you would still be left with our first question. Well, where'd they come from? You still wouldn't have solved where they came from in the first place. Now, let me ask you, does that feel similar to the leaves just sort of blowing on the sidewalk in front of you as a natural order? Or does it sound more like the watch? Intelligence, design, purpose fit into the creation. Psalm 19:1 says, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the works of his hands. John 1:3 says, through him all things were made. Without him, nothing has been made that has been made. Amen? Now, skeptics will propose various physical theories in an attempt to remove God from this. They'll suggest things such as, well, the existence of a metaverse. And in the world of theoretical, of theories, this is a plausible idea. This idea that there's infinite number of worlds, and eventually, with an infinite number of worlds, eventually one of them is going to pull the lever 122 times, and we're going to have this. So there's the theory of the metaverse. But the other theory that's actually more prominent is something that we refer to as the lucky us hypothesis, which basically says it happened, so just accept it and be happy about it, that it happened. But again, I have challenged you with this original question. Both of those theories require faith. Do they require bigger faith than John 1:3? I would suggest to you that they do. I would suggest they require more faith than John 1:3 that says, through him all things were made. And without him, nothing that has been made has been made. I would suggest that requires less faith and actually is more logical to look at. But not only is there evidence for intelligence and power behind all that exists, but when we look at that, it actually shortens, can you see how we find this evidence? It actually shortens the faith gap on the path to belief that the God of the Bible truly does exist. Let me add one more before we're done here today. One more piece of evidence that kind of steps outside of the physical world a little bit. Did you ever notice that regardless of a person's worldview, regardless if they're an adult or a child, if they're educated or uneducated, everyone will say and they'll believe things similar to this. You'll find yourselves in a situation where everyone, regardless of who they are, will say things like, well, how would you like it if somebody did that to you? Or you'll find somebody saying, hey, that's mine. You better give it back when you're done. Or you'll find somebody saying, hey, it's not nice to pick on innocent people. You probably find yourself in situations where you've thought or heard people say these things. Well, these statements are not just statements about things that make me happy or sad. They're not just statements about things that I like or dislike. When we make these statements, when we throw these words out into society, we're actually appealing to a moral standard. And we're making these statements under the assumption that all people are playing by the same guidebook. We're all playing by the same rules of fair play. Look even at our kids. You don't have to teach it, we know this. You don't need to teach a toddler the word mine. When they turn 2, it's like that's like God's gift to them at age 2. You know the word mine. And they have that one. So we know that. But what else don't you have to teach them? You don't have to teach them that when someone takes their toy away, they feel that there's some sense of injustice that's taken place in that. And they'll stare at the other child and be like, how could you possibly have done that? That was mine, and you took it from me. They're 2. They have no ability for rational comprehension of these of words and theories to be downloaded from mom and dad into them. But at 2 years old, they feel a sense of injustice has been done to them. C.S. Lewis, famous philosopher and professor at Oxford, who actually was a skeptic for most of his life. He lists this as one of the major reasons, major influences that led him to become a believer, to become a Christian. And as he points out, as he examined this, he said that while people in our families, in our society, while we will defend and we will reinforce certain rules, we do not find anywhere, there's no place where we find that we explicitly teach those rules to people. It seems like these rules are all sort of built in to people naturally. Now there's slight variations on how they're nurtured and how people are led through these, but there seems to be this common view of morality that spans culture and spans time. And again, in the book of Romans, Paul talks about in chapter 2 when he says this. He says, even Gentiles. Now, Paul's writing, this is being written to Jews who had God's written law, the 10 Commandments and, the first few books of the Bible. They had that. That included God's moral law written down for them. And so now he's saying to them, he's like, look, even the Gentiles, those who are not Jews, even the Gentiles who do not have God's written law, show that they know his law when they instinctively obey it, even without having heard it. This provides more evidence for the existence of God. Because in order for us to have this common objective moral law, there has to be, again, outside of ourselves, a moral law giver. And Christians would say that moral law giver is God. We would say it is God who does that. And as Paul continues in chapter 2, he then says this, they demonstrate that God's law, this objective moral lawgiver, has written his law upon their hearts. For their own consciences and thoughts either accuse them or tell them that they're doing right. You do not need to believe in God to know and to follow this moral law because God has written it on our hearts. As people who are created in his image, that's part of how he has revealed himself. That's part of how he's revealed his existence amongst us. He has written his law upon our hearts. Now, people who oppose this will say, well, no, morality is a product of culture. It's a product of culture. We do teach it. We We absorb it from the world around us. It's a product of culture. And so if that's the case, though, then it follows the logic that what one person believes is right and wrong in one particular time and place would not be what another person considers right and wrong in another time and place. That means morality becomes relative. And if morality is relative, if that's true, and morality is relative, then it's wrong for you to impose your morality upon another person. Does that make sense? If it's relative, if it's what's true for me is good for me, but what's good for you is good for you. You may have heard that. Relativity of morality. If that's true, then it's wrong for me to impose my morality upon you. That means that if you cut me off in traffic, I can get mad about it, but I have no right to say you're wrong. I have no right to say that. That means if I get fired without cause, I can disagree with the decision and not like it, but I can't say my boss is bad because those are moral statements. If morality is relative, there is no foundation by which to say that racism is wrong, that euthanasia is a problem. There's no basis to say the 60 scoop shouldn't have happened if morality is relative. We can disagree with people, but we have no basis on which to morally judge them if it's all relative. But we do know, don't we? We do know some things are right and some things are wrong. We know that. We all live with an objective moral code. We know it's wrong to get cut off in traffic. We know it's wrong to fire somebody without cause. We know it's wrong to hate somebody based upon their race. We know it's wrong to hurt innocent people. Naturalistic theories are not sufficient to explain why this exists. Naturalistic theories do not have sufficient reason to explain why those things are right or wrong. Know what else they can't prove? They can't prove why in our society things like altruism exist. But why would one person, from a natural selective process, why would one person give their life for another? Why would I sacrifice something of myself for you? It doesn't fit the natural process. It can't explain why love exists. It can't explain why grace and mercy and sacrifice exist. But I want to explain to you that those virtues of love, sacrifice, mercy, grace, those are the attributes of God. Those are demonstrations of his work and his presence among us. And these provide further reason and evidence to believe that he exists. So I leave you with this question. How can we believe that God exists? Well, based upon the origin of the universe, based upon the complexity and the fine-tuning of all that we see in the world around us, and based upon the fact that there is an objective moral law that we experience and live by, I believe the most logical and rational position is to say, God exists. There is a God. Now, there's more that I could say to each of these things, and it's been a lot to take in today. And if you want, you can scan that Pew Portal code in front of you. There's sermon notes there where you'll find some of this stuff there. But as I close, I just want to challenge you to consider this. I want you to consider, what are you placing your faith in? Like whatever you believe in, any of these things, it requires a position of faith. How do you account for all that exists? How do you account for the beauty, the intricacy of all that exists? How do you account for the presence of morality in the fashion that we experience it? And when you look at the available evidence, where does it honestly lead you to? Now, some people will say, there is no God. There's just natural events. That's all that there is. But again, where does that lead you to? And the positions that it leads you to, the beliefs that it leads you to, I ask you this, will they take more or less faith than the existence of God? Do they make more or less logic than the existence of God? And what I actually find with a lot of people I talk to about this, and I love talking about this stuff if you want to have more conversations about this, what I actually find is that when I talk to people why they arrived at a natural cause, a non-God origin cause of these things, the problem was they began with a presupposition. They began with the presupposition that there can be no God. And if you start with that presupposition, then you've not even considered it as an option. But then you ask, well, why? Why have you started with the presupposition there can be no God? And if you really get people honest with you, the reason being is because if there is a God, it's going to cost me something. In fact, if there is a God, it will cost you everything. Because if there is a God, that means that you have to cease to be your own God. It means that you are accountable to a higher power. And it means that you need to begin to follow his will and his way for you. I often find that the issue is not evidence, the issue is not faith, the issue is this. The issue is control. The issue is control. But here's the thing, folks. You can't escape truth. You can either accept the truth in this life and have it set you free, or you can face it in the life to come. But there truly is a God who loves you and sent his son to die upon the cross for you, that you could know him and have a relationship with him. Now, for those of us here who have acknowledged him and have placed our faith in him, I pray that what we've covered today, this foundational question, this foundational information, I pray that it has reinforced your faith. I pray that you've perhaps learned some new information that you could share with others. I pray that it has given you confidence and the ability to stand upon your convictions. I pray that it has lit a passion and a desire within you to grow in your knowledge and your experience of him. I pray that that has taken place through what we've discussed today. And with that in mind, can I invite you to all stand with me as the team comes here to lead us in a time of worship and declaration. And we're just going to close our service today by declaring just how majestic, just how powerful, and just how awesome and great our God is.